explore what that would involve. Now, you indicated in your statement to the House that this would apply to agricultural goods, for example. Is that correct?
Well, first of all, can I congratulate you, Chairman, on your election as Chairman of the Liaison Committee.
Yeah.
Yes, if I look at the question of what we've put into the Joint Progress Report on Northern Ireland, of course, there are 3 stages in terms of looking at the commitment on no hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. The first is, as you say, that we expect and intend to be able to achieve this through the negotiations on the overall arrangement between the EU and the UK. The second is, the second fallback, which you didn't refer to in your question, is failing that we would look at specific solutions for the unique circumstance of Northern Ireland, and failing that we fall into the full alignment, as was said in the progress report. I think sometimes when this is being discussed, people forget there are already specific differences in relation to and specific solutions for Northern Ireland. The all island of Ireland electricity market, for example, is already in existence. There are already some arrangements in relation to agriculture. But as to what would be necessary in terms of looking at those arrangements, were we to have to fall back to that third option, and I emphasise it is the third option, those, of course, will be a matter that we would need to look at and negotiate at the time. Our focus is on the first option, i.e. now we can start, we've got sufficient progress, we can start to look at the overall relationship between us and the European Union. That is where we'll be putting our work and effort and focus.
Indeed. But since the government's made a very clear commitment to no infrastructure, no checks, no controls, in all circumstances, all 3 of those you've just laid out, I'm just focusing on the full alignment fallback. And the question I just put again, would that cover agricultural goods, yes or no?
Well, the reason I answered in the way I did is because, of course, that is still in the progress report, but I don't want people to assume that this is the process, that this is the solution that we are working towards.
I do understand.
We're working towards the first one. The issues such as the agricultural trade, the movement of agricultural livestock and goods need for the agri-food industry between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland is obviously an issue that we would have to be looking at. But as to how we would achieve the objectives that we both want to achieve in those circumstances, that will be a matter for negotiation should we actually get into that position. Should it become clear that neither of the first 2 options are available for us or are going to be possible. I'm sure that we're going to be able to achieve the first option. We've already put forward some ideas as to how we can achieve this. We've published papers on this, and now that we've got sufficient progress, now we're out of phase 1 of the negotiations, we can actually start to look at these in detail, because the problem we've had so far is whereas we've been putting ideas forward, actually we haven't been able to negotiate or discuss these with the other side in these negotiations because they've been clear we've been in phase 1. Now we can actually start doing that in earnest.
So are you telling us that actually you can't say at this stage whether it would cover agricultural goods or, for example, manufactured goods? Because, as I understood it, the purpose of putting in the fallback option was to offer assurance in all circumstances to all of those involved. If you're saying you can't tell us what it covers, then what exactly does it mean?
Well, it means that we will ensure that there is no hard border. How we achieve that in specific areas and specific sectors would be a means for the negotiations. That's what I'm saying in my answers to you. We're clear that in terms of no hard border, as I say, we believe we can achieve that in the overall relationship, and we've put forward some ideas as to how that can be done. We're now able to discuss those specific ideas, and this is about no hard border, no physical infrastructure.
But surely, Prime Minister, if it doesn't cover all goods, those that are excluded would then, of necessity, be subject to checks, and therefore your commitment that you've given to there being no hard border, no checks, no controls, could not be delivered. Either everything is in or everything isn't in. It's a very simple question about how this would work.
Yes, and it is a very simple answer. What we are going to deliver is no hard border, no physical infrastructure at the border.
So, all right, well then you can't confirm what it would cover. Can I move on now to timing? Now, the EU Commission has, in its draft negotiating guidelines published this morning, has said that the transitional arrangements should last no longer than the 31st of December 2020. Do you think that that will be long enough?
Well, as you know, I think as you know full well, in my Florence speech, I said that I thought that probably the implementation period would be around 2 years.
Right.
That was what the indications we had at the time. We're about to start the negotiations, and obviously what we've seen today is that position coming from the European Union. We will be in negotiations as to what, quickly into negotiations as to what the implementation period should cover. They've set that end December 2020 date because that covers their current budget plan period, so that has a neatness for them, if I can put it like that. But we will obviously have to discuss, because this is a practical issue about how long certain changes would need to take to be put in place.
But before you can make the changes, you have to have an agreement on the new free trade relationship, which is your number one objective. Do you think those negotiations can be completed in the implementation period, the transition period? Do you think there'll be sufficient time to complete them?
Sorry, you said sufficient time to complete them in the implementation period?
In the implementation period, because, or to ask the question another way, is it still your view that you can complete negotiating a free trade agreement by March 2019?
It is. That is what we are working to, and that is what I believe we can do. And I believe that's important. I believe everybody wants to know on what basis they're going to be operating in the future, such that the implementation period is a practical period, which is going towards implementing the agreement that we have with the European Union. I've said, I and others ministers have made the point in the past that, of course, we start off from a different point from other third countries, as we will be from other third countries negotiating with the European Union, because we're already a member and already trading with them on a particular basis. As you will know full well, there is we can't legally sign the new trade agreement with the European Union until we're a third country, until we're out of the European Union, 29th of March 2019. But I believe we can negotiate that arrangement in that time.
Now, that's the view that you hold and the government holds, but the view on the other side of the negotiating table is that the best that's going to be achieved by March 2019 is a scoping of what a free trade agreement is going to cover. And certainly I've met nobody who thinks it'll be possible to negotiate all of the details of that by March 2019. Now, why is the government so confident that it can be done when those with whom it is negotiating don't think it can?
Well, a lot is often said about the time that it takes to negotiate trade deals. There are different experiences around the world of the length of time it takes to negotiate trade deals. As I say, the reason I'm confident that we can do this within the time concerned is because we start off from a different point. So we haven't got a situation where country A is coming to negotiate with the EU, not having had any arrangements with the EU before. We come from the point where we're actually a member of the European Union, we're operating on the same basis at the moment, and therefore I think that starts us off from a different position in terms of our negotiations on trade in the future. Of course, we're not just talking in phase 2 of negotiating the trade agreement, we're also talking about negotiating the future security partnership that we want to have with the European Union.
And finally, from me, were you aware that no impact assessments were being carried out by government departments looking at the impact, the effect of Brexit on different sectors of the economy, or indeed on the implications of leaving the customs union? Did you know that that wasn't being done?
What I was aware that that government departments were doing, led of course by DEXU, was ensuring that they were in touch with different sectors and continue to be in touch with different sectors that are taking their views on implications in terms of what matters to them. This is what is in the sectoral analysis which has been made available to your committee. That was the analysis that was undertaken and is indeed ongoing. We continue to talk to business. It isn't that there's a point in time where you say, well, what is the impact here? Actually, we didn't produce impact assessments as you've described them. We produced that sectoral analysis. We continue to talk with business. We continue to talk with representatives of all sectors on the issues that matter to them.
Just observe that we're about to publish most of what you've given to us, and I think the public will see there is no assessment of the impact of Brexit on the different sectors of the economy, but we can pursue that on another occasion.
Thank you. We're going to come on to a group of questions from Treasury, Bays and International Trade, starting with Nicky Morgan.
Good afternoon, Prime Minister. On Monday in the House, you said that, based on reasonable assumptions, the financial settlement is estimated to stand at between £35 billion and £39 billion in current terms. Over what period of time would you expect that amount of money to be paid to honour our obligations to the EU?
If you look at the Joint Progress Report, it makes clear that none of the payments that are required will be required from us until they fall due, unless there is another agreement between the UK and the European Union that they will be paid at another time. Some of the implications, some of the elements in the financial settlement that have been looked at are elements that may arise at some stage in the future, but the assessment that has been made is obviously has looked at those alongside what most people would consider to be the more regular payments, if I can describe them as that, because I made clear in my Florence speech that we didn't want anybody in the current budget plan to fear that as a result of us leaving, they were going to have to pay more or receive less from in relation to their membership of the European Union.
Which I entirely agree with. And the reason I'm asking is because obviously the Treasury Select Committee has taken evidence over the last few weeks on the budget and the recent OBR fiscal outlook. And in that outlook, the OBR talk about taking a fiscally neutral approach, that from 2019-20 onwards, any reduction in expenditure transfers to the EU would be recycled fully into extra domestic spending. And they have a chart whereby they anticipate EU contributions ending in the year 18-19, and then domestic spending rising, or increased domestic spending, from 2019-20 onwards. So one set of expenditure replacing the other. But it sounds to me, from what you've just said, as if that may not be the right way for the OBR to approach it, on the basis we may be paying more money in relation to our EU contributions over some years to come.
No, we won't be paying. I mean, I wouldn't want you to go away with the impression that there's a lengthy period of time over which each year we are going to be paying money to the European Union. That is not going to be the case. But to the extent that the financial settlement covers payments that we would have made as a member state, and we won't be required to pay more or sooner than we would have had to as a member state, then the settlement is already provided for in the budget forecast. It is not the case that these sums of money are additional to that budget forecast, because they're baked in. The OBR has already baked in payments.
But the OBR's baking in of anticipated future domestic spending may not be correct. So that may be something that the OBR might have to revisit in their future fiscal outlooks. Would you agree with that?
Well, what the OBR has done is taken a fiscally neutral approach to this. So they've said that any savings that are made from not paying to the European Union will be recycled into domestic spending. They haven't assumed how that particular expenditure will be used, but they, as I say, the sums are covered over the period of time. There will be, as the Joint Progress Report makes clear, a point at which a decision on the timing of those would be possible if it was felt appropriate to change that timing from what is in the agreement so far.
Let me move on to something else, which is obviously in the news today, which is financial services. And the financial services sector paid £72 billion in taxes to the UK government last year. And I think it's one area that you would agree where actually we are already operating on the same basis as the EU. In fact, the UK has been very influential on EU financial services legislation. Now, Michel Barnier has said this morning that he doesn't expect a free trade agreement to cover financial services. How are you going to persuade him that that's not a wise course of action?
Well, we're going into a negotiation, I think, and what I would say is that the City of London is obviously important to us here in the UK, but actually it's of significant importance to the rest of the European Union as well. I'm afraid I don't have the exact quote, but I understand that the Governor of the Bank of England has commented on this earlier today, and I think used a phrase such as, the City of London is actually the banker for Europe, and there's significant, it's a significant provider of capital finance for Europe, and I think as we come into discussions, there will be a greater recognition of the role that the City plays in the financial provisions for Europe as a whole, and not just for the United Kingdom.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we're now going to move on to Rachel Reeves. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Prime Minister, for coming to give evidence today. Our Select Committee has taken evidence from a number of business organisations and businesses, and the Association of British Pharmaceutical Industries said on the issue of regulation, it would really not make sense for us to have something where we had a divergent regulation. You, Prime Minister, have spoken about regulatory alignment. I wonder precisely what does that mean, and how is it different, if it is, from what we have today?
Well, what I set out in the Florence speech was that if we look at the question of regulations and directives, they fall into different categories. There are some of those that are of no impact on trade relations, have no relevance to trade relations. There will be some areas where we have the same goals, the same objectives in terms of regulation, but wish to achieve them by different means. There'll be other areas where we have the same goals and accept that they should be achieved by the same means. As part of the negotiations, we now go into the process of looking at that in detail and determining, as one would in any trade agreement. Any trade agreement, there is an agreement as to the regulations, the standards on which that trade is going to take place. That's what we will now be doing with the European Union.
So regulatory alignment could mean that we have different rules and regulations here compared with what they have in the other European Union countries. Regulatory alignment might include, under what you've set out, different rules and regulations here compared with what's on the rest of the continent.
Alignment means that we have the same objectives. We may achieve those objectives by the same means, or we may choose to achieve those objectives by different means. In any trade agreement, that will be part of the discussion that takes place, part of the negotiation that takes place, and it'll be no different here.
So, when we took evidence from the Food and Drink Federation, they said that convergence is a good thing, convergence of regulations is a good thing because it brings down the cost. If we have different rules and regulations, even if we have the same objectives, Prime Minister, that might mean higher costs for industry. The food and drink industry seem to think that. In the car manufacturing sector, they spoke about semi-catastrophic effects of having to stop production if EU-type approvals weren't able to be provided by the UK vehicle certification. They are worried, businesses are worried about us diverging from the rules and regulations. Even if we have the same objectives, they're worried about diverging from the specific rules and regulations because that will make it harder for trade. Is that what businesses are saying to you, Prime Minister? Do you understand their concerns?
What businesses want to be able to do is to continue to trade as tariff-free and as frictionless a basis with the European Union as they are able to do today. In one of the examples that you cited, I think it showed how this can be achieved in a number of ways, because it referenced UK authorities being able to deliver, if you like, the standards that are expected in the European Union. This is, in any trade relationship, in order to be able to have that trade on the basis that is negotiated, agreements will be reached as to what the standards are, what the regulations under which that trade takes place. This will be no different. What we're going into now is a negotiation which will look at different areas and will, and we're very clear that will be goods and services, and we'll be discussing how we achieve that trade and what that overall trading relationship should be.
The reason why the Vehicle Certification Agency in the UK can give those type of approvals is because we are a member of the European Union. It's similar with other areas. For example, the European Aviation Safety Agency or the European Medicines Agency. In the House last week, your Brexit Minister Dominic Raab said that where there is a demonstrable national interest in pursuing a continued relationship with an agency or other EU body, the government will look very carefully at that. Will the government look at whether we might remain in things like the European Aviation Safety Agency or the European Medicines Agency or indeed Euratom? Are those possibilities, are any of those still on the table?
Well, I would, if I may differentiate between the various bodies that you have cited there. I mean, on the European Aviation Safety Agency, actually it's UK expertise that has made a significant contribution to the high standards of aviation safety that we have in Europe, and we would intend to maintain consistently high standards. So, of course, we will look at the question of our continued participation in EASA, but that, as I say, will be a matter for the negotiations. The reason I said I wanted to differentiate between the agencies you cited is because Euratom is a different case because of the very unique legal relationship in relation to Euratom. And that's why when we formally notified of our intention to leave the EU, we started the process for leaving Euratom, because they do share a common institutional framework which makes them, as I say, uniquely legally joined. But what we are doing, as you know, we've been putting a nuclear safeguards bill through in the which has started in the House of Lords. We've agreed principles for addressing the key separation issues relating to our withdrawal from Euratom. That includes safeguards, future regime, principles of ownership for most special fissile material. And we're going to continue to apply international standards on nuclear safety as agreed by the International Atomic Energy Authority. So it's a good example of where we will be leaving a particular institution but continuing to operate on a basis that enables people to continue to have confidence in what the UK is doing and continue to work with us and move material between us.
Thank you. We'll come on to Angus Brendan.
Thank you very much. Prime Minister, it's a year, I think, since your last at the Liaison Committee, and in that year you triggered the election last March. You triggered Article 50 last March. When you triggered the Article 50 last March, did you plan to hold a general election or call a general election a month later?
No. As I made clear at the time that I called the general election, having seen some of the response to the issues around Brexit, I felt it was appropriate to call that general election.
But at the point of the Article 50 being called, the end of March, were you planning to hold a general election at that point, knowing you had 2 years to go before the United Kingdom would leave the European Union and have a lot of work to do in those 2 years?
Yes, of course there was a lot of work to do in those 2 years.
Did you plan to hold the election?
And when I did call the general election, I was aware of the fact that we had work to do in relation to the Brexit negotiations. And as you know, because I've said it, I made the final decision on the general election at a time, it was over that Easter time, just before we came back into Parliament.
Having triggered Article 50, having called the election, did you then imagine you'd go back 6 months later and beg the European Union for 2 more years in the Florence speech?
I haven't begged the European Union for 2 more years. If you look at what I said in the Lancaster House speech, you will see that we were already talking about the concept of a smooth and orderly process of withdrawing from the European Union. That is what the implementation period is about. This is not 2 more years to negotiate with the European Union. This is about 2 years when practically both businesses and governments will be able to put in place the changes necessary to move from the current relationship to the future partnership that we will have.
But the reality is the 2 years that were triggered in March 2017 was not long enough. And in that period you also held an election, and now you want this 2-year period to go on longer. Was it wise to hold an election in that time when you knew the time would be so short, or did you not realise time would be so short?
No, I'm sorry, because I don't accept the comments you're making about the timing in relation to the implementation period. This is not, we've not suddenly said, because there was a general election this year, we need an extra 2 years on the other end of this negotiation. We've been very clear all along that there would be, in order to have a smooth and orderly Brexit, in order to have that smooth and orderly leaving of the European Union, we would want to ensure that businesses and governments were able to adjust to the future partnership. That is the purpose of the implementation period. That implementation period was always going to be after the point at which we've left the European Union, which, having triggered in March of this year, is going to be the end of March, 29th of March 2019.
I think people will draw their own conclusions. Prime Minister, on trade deals, how many countries will the UK have increased trade barriers with after Brexit?
Well, after Brexit, we will be in a position, we're looking to ensure that we're able not only to have new trade deals with countries around the world, but also there are obviously a number of trade arrangements which are currently held with the European Union, and we'll be looking at our relationship with those countries once we leave the EU and are no longer subject to those arrangements.
We will have increased trade barriers with the EU 27, that's definite.
Sorry, I didn't catch your question.
We will have increased trade barriers and tariffs with the EU 27. We have a further 40 agreements covering another 67 countries. So the UK is heading for a situation, very possibly, where we'll have increased trade barriers with up to 94 countries. How do you feel about that, Prime Minister?
Well, I don't accept the premise of your question, I'm afraid.
So
the premise of your question is based on us not being able, first of all, to negotiate a trade deal with the European Union and an expectation that there were bound to be increased trade barriers as a result of any negotiations that we have. I don't accept the premise of that. The premise of the question
is based on the reality that you can have zero increase, which would maintain what we have at the moment, or we can go up to as many as 94. My original question in this area was how many countries from between 0 and 94 will the UK have increased trade barriers with?
No, and I have, as I have made clear, there will be, when we have left the European Union, we will be looking to have trade deals in place. Obviously, there's a question of what we can do during the implementation period, but we intend to have trade deals in place with countries around the world with which, in some cases, the European Union may not currently have trade deals with those countries. There will be countries where the European Union does have trade deals, and we will be looking at the relationship the United Kingdom will have with those countries post-Brexit as a result of no longer being part of those EU trade deals. And we've already started discussions with a number of those countries as to how we can ensure.
Just as a basic here, Prime Minister, do you accept the premise that it's possible for the UK to have increased trade barriers with up to 94 countries? Do you accept that possibility?
No, what I'm saying is that what we will be doing is the premise of your question, if I may, is that the United Kingdom is not going to be able to negotiate trade deal either with the European Union or with any of those countries with whom we currently have a trade deal as a member of the European Union. Now, one possibility is that, of course, we could roll over those arrangements with those countries as an individual country after we leave the European Union. We have already started discussions with a number of countries as to what our future relationship with them will be. Because our aim is to ensure not that we see new trade barriers being put in place for the United Kingdom, but that actually we see improved trade relationships with countries around the world.
Final question. There are political prisoners at the moment in the European Union, in Spain. Do you have any particular view on that, Prime Minister?
Sorry, I didn't...
There are political prisoners in Spain at the moment. Do you have any view on political prisoners currently in the European Union in 2017? Is your government have a view?
I don't recognise. I assume that you are making a reference to the fact that the Spanish government has ensured that the Spanish constitution is abided with and that the rule of law, that people abide by the rule of law in Spain. And we support the Spanish government in believing that the Spanish constitution should be applied and the rule of law should be applied.
Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to come on to a group of questions now about Northern Ireland foreign affairs and home affairs, starting with Andrew Murison.
Well, Mr. Good afternoon. You seem like a long way away down there. You've had a really tough day. My apologies, we're making it a lot worse for you. Congratulations on bringing us to where we are at the moment. Can I ask you, who is going to pay for the rights of Northern Ireland residents who identify themselves as being Irish and therefore will continue with the possibility of an EU passport after Brexit? Things like, for example, the European Health Insurance Card, and probably more importantly, other further rights that the European Union may grant in the future. There are three possible pays for this, of course. There's the United Kingdom, there's the Republic of Ireland, and there's the European Union itself. Which one of those will pay for those rights?
Well, the question of the... Sorry, I was just checking the references, because the question of things like the healthcare rights were actually covered in the joint progress report that was published between the United Kingdom and the European Union. This has been exactly one of the issues that has been under discussion between the in order to ensure citizens' rights in the future, and making sure that those arrangements could continue as they do at present.
Well, clearly, but there may be rights that the European Union decides to award its citizens in the future, and very often rights do have a price tag. And whilst the rights are a good thing, clearly we have to consider who is going to pay for them. So in the future, were the European Union to award rights, and given that we have accepted that those identifying as Irish will continue as European Union citizens, though resident in Northern Ireland, it would be useful to know who would actually be responsible for paying for any consequentials.
Well, I'm sorry, I've just been shown the reference in the Joint Progress Report, which I was looking for, it specifies in the European Health Insurance Card Scheme that persons whose competent state is the UK and are in the EU 27 on the specified date and vice versa, whether on a temporary stay or resident, continue to be eligible for healthcare reimbursement, including under the EHIC scheme, as long as that stay, residence or treatment continues. And that obviously that's an agreement that is going to take place in the future, so we will continue to be able to do that. And
Prime Minister, that would hold for any other further rights that the European Union might wish to award within healthcare or elsewhere?
Well, no, that is specific about the current arrangements that residents have within the European Union, and therefore because that citizens' rights element of this is about ensuring that the choices people have already made will continue to be respected in the future, and it's in that context that is set.
Okay, all right, thank you. So any further rights that the European Union may determine would be paid for by who?
Well, as it also says in the Joint Progress Report, specifically in relation to Northern Ireland, both parties agree that the withdrawal agreement should respect and be without prejudice to the rights, opportunities and identity that come with European Union citizenship for such people, that is the people of Northern Ireland who are Irish citizens and will continue to enjoy rights as EU citizens, and in the next phase of negotiations will examine arrangements required to give effect to the ongoing exercise of and access to those rights.
Well, thank you. Can I press you on paragraph 49 of the joint report and the constructive ambiguity contained therein? The default position is obviously option 3, which you have cited. And I'm puzzling over some of the words because it mentions the whole island economy, the all-island economy, now and in the future in relation to the rules of the internal market and the customs union, which may be subject to full alignment. Now, given that the all-island economy now or in the future means practically everything, all sectors, all industries, all products, I'm wondering where the divergence may emerge in order to continue to provide our right honourable friend, the member for North Somerset, with a job.
If I can just, I'm afraid I will repeat the point that I made in response to the very first set of questions that I was given. This is not the default position in the sense it's the default position, because there are 2 phases that we will be going through, and I fully expect that we will be able to resolve the issue about the border in Northern Ireland in the first element of negotiations, i.e. through the overall EU-UK relationship. There's a second stage we can go to if we fail that. This is then the final, as I say, the default, rather than being the automatic stage that we go to if we don't manage to achieve this through the EU-UK relationship.
I have to press you on this because we have to look at the worst possible option, and option 3 is clearly the worst option.
Well, and you will, I'm sure, excuse me if I say that I do sometimes hope that people would look at the best possible option as well as only ever looking at the worst possible option, as you have described it. This is to give the guarantee that we will ensure that there is no hard border in Northern Ireland. The all-Ireland economy already is there in a number of ways. I cited some of the examples in relation to the first question that I was asked. But if you go on to read in paragraph 50, it's clear that we will also ensure that we don't do this in a way that disrupts or damages the economic integrity of the United Kingdom. As it says, no new regulatory barriers develop between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK unless actually consistent with the Belfast Agreement. The Northern Ireland Executive and Assembly have agreed that.
Where do you think we can diverge? We must be able to diverge, and at the moment, that option 3 suggests that we simply will not diverge at all.
What option 3 is saying is that if we get to that point, we will ensure that it is possible for trade to continue across the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland without having a hard border and without having that physical infrastructure at the border. That is the commitment that has been given. It's a commitment that we believe, because we've already put forward some proposals on this, can be achieved as part of the wider relationship between the UK and the European Union. We will now be able to discuss that, to negotiate that in detail with all the parties concerned. We haven't been able to do that up until now because we've been in phase 1 of the negotiations. Now we've got sufficient progress and move into phase 2. We'll be able to look at this in detail with the other parties.
Thank you.
Thank you. Tom.
Prime Minister, thank you for coming this afternoon. What does Global Britain mean to you?
Global Britain means a United Kingdom that is playing a full role on the world stage. It has various elements to it. Part of it is the trading relationships that we want to develop around the world. Another part is us continuing to play our role in multilateral institutions around the world, so continuing to play our role in the United Nations, playing our role in NATO, in the commitments on defence and security that we give, and being an upholder of the values that underpin our society and democracy here in the United Kingdom.
Your National Security Advisor specifically cited only the other day to the Joint Committee on National Security Strategy. The 3 elements are investing in partnerships, strengthening the rules-based system and boosting prestige. Today, with the reports that so many of Her Majesty's ships are alongside, the boosting prestige does seem to be rather in concern.
Well, I would say just look at what we're doing around the world and what our armed forces are doing around the world. Our Royal Navy is in the Mediterranean, continuing to save lives in the Mediterranean, and we've committed, as I did at the EU Council last week, to continuing to be in the Mediterranean as long as is necessary. Our Air Force and the work that's been doing in the coalition we've been doing in the coalition in Iraq and Syria, for example. And just last week at the Sun Military Awards, I was pleased to present an award to Operation Rumen, representatives of Operation Rumen, which was the Joint Services Award, of course, led by the Navy, which went in and gave support to our overseas territories and others after the hurricanes in the Caribbean. I think people see a United Kingdom around the world that is playing its role. Of course, commitments we've made on defence are an important part of this, so also our commitment to maintain the 0.7% of GNI being spent on aid. I think that shows a United Kingdom with commitments around the world.
And what do you see us doing to increase the rules-based system?
I think that is something that we're doing in a number of ways. I think part of that is about working with those countries, working to persuade those countries who currently take action which are against the rules-based system to sign up to an international order, which is that rules-based system. I think it's about the contributions we make in a number of international bodies to uphold the rules-based system, be that, as I said, within the United Nations or indeed in other bodies that we're party of.
May I ask which nations might be your priorities, and when are you going to publish, or get the relevant departments perhaps rather, to publish your priorities on exactly these areas?
Well, in terms of the overall response that we have as the United Kingdom and global Britain, of course, we have priorities in a number of parts around the world, but in different ways around various parts of the world.
And may I switch to Europe, if I may? You cited, of course, the deep and special partnership that I know many of us hope for. May I ask, you've spoken a little bit, or rather the government has spoken a little bit about the relationship with CFSP and CSDP. Could you highlight how you see us playing our role in those two organisations, or whether we have a role in those two organisations?
Well, I think, if I may, I would describe it in a slightly different way. I think what we want to continue to do as part of the Deep and Special Partnership is, of course, continue to be able to be discussing with and contributing to these issues of foreign policy and defence. We've said we're unconditionally committed to maintaining European security. We will do that. Obviously, we play a key role in NATO in doing that, but would also look to the possibility of being involved in some agreements that take place in Europe. I mean, PESCO, for example, which was launched on the European Council last week, we are not party to that, but there is a possibility on particular operations for other countries to be involved in that. On the foreign policy side, I think this is, we would want to continue to be able to work with the countries in the European Union 27 on key issues that are of importance to us. One of the areas, for example, that the UK has been very clear, as I said in my statement on Monday, that we've led on, is the need for sanctions in relation to Russia. So there are issues like that where we would want to be continuing to work with others to ensure that we're upholding the values that we continue to share as Europeans.
And you rightly highlighted our structured cooperation through organisations like NATO as part of guaranteeing our security and European security. Would you agree that we require structured cooperation in terms of alongside the EU in order to make sure that our sanctions regimes are as effective as they should be?
Well, of course, one of the things that we will be doing as we look at legislation in relation to the position that will apply to the United Kingdom once we come out of the European Union is obviously to make sure, precisely to put forward legislation to ensure we are able to apply sanctions.
But that's our own sanctions. I meant being structured alongside others.
Yes, but the point I'm making is that if we're not in the European Union, we won't necessarily be party of that regime, but we will be putting in place a regime that would enable us to ensure that we are putting sanctions in place where we agree that it's appropriate to do so. Just as, I mean, today we obviously put sanctions in place, not just that are applied by the European Union, but also United Nations sanctions.
Thank you. Yvette.
Afternoon, Prime Minister. Ideally, do you want us to stay full members of Europol and the European arrest warrant after Brexit?
Well, we've had debates across the floor of the House, you and I, in the past about Europol and the European arrest warrant, and obviously I argued with our JHA opt-out that we should remain part of Europol and the European arrest warrant. I think there are benefits in both of these. This will have to be part of the negotiations in future, and whether we remain will be part of depend on the offer and what we're able to negotiate in these.
Just in terms of our objectives, in an ideal world, is that something we were aiming for, to keep the full membership of both?
Well, I've spoken about the value of Europol and the European arrest warrant. There are a number of programmes on the criminal justice and security side in Europe that I think we should look at as where there are benefits not just to the UK from being a member, but benefits to the rest of the European Union for us being a member. And I would say some of those are around exchange of data at borders, for example. But the reason I answered initially as I did is that, of course, it will depend on the basis on which the European Union, as we negotiate our new security relationship, the basis on which it would be possible for us to be members of those.
I think what would be very helpful is to know whether it still is our best objective, even if I accept it is subject to the negotiations, and it's disappointing if you're not able to be clear on that. The second thing I want just quick clarification on is at the border. I know that at Dover they are looking at number plate recognition cameras and other ways of doing checks. Are you clear that that is not something that would be an option in Northern Ireland? Because you said there'll be no physical infrastructure. Can you confirm you won't look at cameras in the Northern Ireland border?
We've said there will be no physical infrastructure in relation to Northern Ireland. We've put forward a number of options as to how we think that border issue can be addressed. And in fact, those are options that could be more applicable more widely in terms of our future relationship between the UK and the European Union. And if I may, just there will be areas where, as I've said right at the very beginning of this process, we're not going to give a running commentary on every detail of our negotiations.
Of course, but
so
our
we're not going to give a running commentary on every aspect as we go into negotiations on these matters.
But our
we will be
physical infrastructure.
We will be discussing how we address these issues. We have said that there will be no physical infrastructure at the border, no hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. So people will be able to move across that border as they do currently. That
cameras
is
have
the
to be
important.
physical. Presumably they're not virtual, they have to be physical. Are you ruling out cameras at the Northern Ireland border?
What I'm saying is that as part of our negotiations, we will be ensuring that there is no hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland.
Okay.
That can be achieved in a number of ways. And I am not going to sit here at the moment and say precisely how we are going to achieve that, because we are going into a negotiation.
Okay, that's also baffling. On the process, now that Amendment 7 is in, can you confirm that there will be a vote on a statute before the withdrawal treaty is ratified?
What we're talking about in terms of the process on the withdrawal treaty is that there will be a vote in Parliament, which we've always said will be a meaningful vote on the withdrawal agreement, which would take place, we would expect it to be able to take place before the European Parliament has had their vote. There would then be a subsequent process that Parliament will go through, inputting the withdrawal agreement and implementation bill through Parliament. So that is what would put the withdrawal agreement into the legal status here in the United Kingdom.
Sure, but now that Amendment 7 has been passed by Parliament, can you confirm that that means there will now be a vote on a statute on the withdrawal agreement before the withdrawal agreement is ratified?
Well, it depends what you're talking about in terms of before there has to be a process. We have to have an agreement.
Process.
We have to have a withdrawal agreement. Before we can bring a withdrawal agreement bill into Parliament for Parliament to agree that withdrawal agreement bill. There will be an opportunity for Parliament to vote on that withdrawal agreement before that legislation is brought into place.
But will there be a vote on a statute before Britain goes through the legal ratification process to ratify the withdrawal agreement treaty as part of the Article 50 process? Can you confirm there will be a vote on primary legislation in this Parliament? That Parliament will have a vote on primary legislation, not simply on a motion?
Well, Parliament will have two opportunities to vote on this issue. The first will be a vote on the withdrawal agreement and whether or not Parliament agrees that withdrawal agreement. Then there will be primary legislation to bring that withdrawal agreement into UK law.
And will that primary legislation happen before Britain goes through the ratification process for the treaty?
Well, we will have had to have... Parliament will have an opportunity to say whether or not it agrees with the treaty that we have agreed with the European Union. There will then be a process of bringing that agreed treaty into UK law.
But I'm still trying to get you to tell us the form of Parliament's vote. Will Parliament now get to vote on a statute rather than a motion before the deal is finalised with Europe?
Parliament will have an opportunity to vote on the deal before it is finalised.
You keep talking about a motion.
But that is a vote.
The consequence of Amendment 7 was to propose it being done on a statute. What's your objection to it being done on a statute rather than a motion, given that the government has ignored motions, for example, the October motion on universal credit, and has a history of doing so? Can you confirm you would have the vote on a statute before the process is finalised, rather than on a motion, because that's what Amendment 7 says?
Well, we will, of course, be looking at Amendment 7, but I think what the principle of what we want to do is to ensure that Parliament is able to have what we have always said would be a meaningful vote before, as I say, before the European Parliament has its vote, and before we then bring that agreement into the legislation here in the United Kingdom. But the bit that ensures that that withdrawal agreement is in UK law will be the EU withdrawal agreement and implementation bill.
And will that happen before the treaty is ratified? Yes or no?
Well, depends what you're talking about by formal ratification of the treaty, because there were various processes in this. Before we can't bring a withdrawal agreement bill before the House unless we've got an agreement, a withdrawal agreement.
So that,
I mean, that's just, you know,
so the answer is no.
You have to have.
No vote on statute.
But Parliament will have voted on that withdrawal agreement. Parliament will have had its say. Parliament will have said whether or not it agrees with that withdrawal agreement.
Thank you. We come to the final group on Brexit questions. I'm starting with Sir William Cash.
On the current withdrawal bill, I wrote to you yesterday as Chairman of the European Scrutiny Committee regarding the disapplication of primary legislation under this bill. This will be the first time in British constitutional history that the courts would be empowered to strike down acts of Parliament under domestic legislation. Of course, as we know from the Factor 10 case and the striking down by the House of Lords of the Merchant Shipping Act 1988, this has been possible where an Act of Parliament is inconsistent with sections 2 and 3 of the current European Communities Act 1972 and the case law of the European Court of Justice, such as the Costa case. However, on our leaving the EU and the repeal of that Act, completely different considerations apply. I raised this issue during the withdrawal bill proceedings on the 21st of November, and I've referred the matter to several Secretaries of State and the Attorney General, as well as to yourself now. Fears have also been expressed, for example, by Lord Neuberger, the former President of the Supreme Court, that the courts could be dragged into the political arena, and there are those who would seek direction to the courts to be clearly included in this bill. The question of how it would be done derives from Clause 5 and 6 of the bill. So I trust that you would agree that this is a matter of such constitutional importance and novelty that uncertainty must be removed and that clear direction must be given to the courts to deal with this matter by government at the report stage on 16th and 17th of January. The issue is not confined to retained EU law, but also to pre-exit enactments. So to avoid any constitutional crisis or clash between Parliament and the courts, and to reaffirm the sovereignty of Parliament, it would be possible to amend the bill to introduce a clear, express statutory provision giving clear direction to the courts on these issues, for example, by drawing on the concept of incompatibility, as we have with the current and existing Human Rights Act 1998. So my question is, what are your own thoughts on this, given the constitutional novelty and the extreme constitutional implications of it all? And would you, following further interdepartmental discussion, in principle, agree to resolve this matter by amendment on the report stage?
Well, I will obviously. Will be responding to your letter in full, and will do so in a timely fashion. One of the issues, and I was just looking at the references in the Joint Progress Report. One of the issues that we have been obviously discussing in part one of the negotiations is how we ensure that citizens' rights the European Union can feel that we have given sufficient guarantee about EU citizens' rights here in the UK for the future. And that is why we have been very clear about the relationship of the rights being brought into the withdrawal agreement and whether or not those rights, the extent to which those rights could be changed in future. And that is, I think, what lies at the heart of the issue that you have raised in relation to the ability of the courts to say that particular legislation takes primacy over other legislation. It's to ensure that consistency of interpretation, but also to ensure that consistency of approach in relation to EU citizens' rights in the future. That's to give people reassurance.
You will look at this very carefully, won't you? I'm sure you will.
I will. Don't worry. I will look very carefully at it and respond to your letter in full.
Well, I'd just very quickly also like to refer to the European Commission recommendations for Council decision and annex on the second phase of negotiations, which the European Commission issued today, it reads very much like an ultimatum. I read it very carefully, and may I urge you to be very robust in your response and language, because in the big picture, given the voters last year voted to leave the European Union, they would do so even more emphatically now if they were to have taken on board the very specific arrangements and proposals that are being put forward by the likes of President Juncker, by President Macron, by Schulz, and so on and so forth, that for ever deeper European integration. If the British voters voted as they did last time, and they now had to confront the questions that are now being put to them about this extraordinary centralisation and deeper integration that's in prospect, don't you agree that they would actually leave on an even bigger scale than they did then?
Well, I think the important thing for the British people is that they are leaving, we are leaving, and of course it will then be up to the EU27 where they take the European Union in future. And as you say, there have been a number of contributions to that debate made by President Juncker, President Macron and others in recent months. But that will be a matter for the EU27. We will be out of that and not part of that. And in response to the comments that you made about the guidelines that have been issued, the draft guidelines that have been issued by the Commission today on phase 2 of the negotiations, of course, these are the starting point of negotiations. And I can assure you that we will be robust in our defence of the United Kingdom's interests.
Thank you. Finally, Bernard, on this section.
Prime Minister, as you know, the Public Administration and Constitution Committee is looking at how to help the civil service become more effective as it faces the challenges of Brexit. Can I ask to start with how confident you can be that the coordination and leadership of DEX-EU across the whole of government to get government ready for day one of Brexit, that these edicts and directions are being effective?
Well, I think that I would say there are a number of ways in which we can ensure that that is taking place. Obviously, we've created a significant number of new roles within government to look at in dealing with Brexit and all the ramifications of Brexit. I mean, the key issue in terms of ensuring that individual departments are operating and doing what they need to do is the direction that comes from not just the Permanent Secretary, but also Secretaries of State within that, and that is brought together in the committee structure that we have within government to provide for that opportunity for discussion, but also agreement, which is then translated to departments. But we do monitor and do constantly look and ask the question as to what is happening and to make sure that the departments are providing what they need to provide and are doing the work that they need to do.
Indeed, and there are 313 Gantt charts, one for each of the work streams across government, charting the progress and the risks to each programme. As Sir Philip Rycroft, the DEX-EU Perm Sec, says that only some 20 programmes are what he describes as moving too slowly. But how can we be confident that these thumbnail assessments are reliable, giving reliable information about the progress of these programmes?
Well, I think that's a process that we go through in terms of challenge that comes from the civil service to departments to ensure that. Then obviously the Cabinet Office plays a role in this, as does DEXU, but also any concerns about departments and whether they are doing the job that they need to do is also from time to time brought to ministers, and ministerial encouragement and direction is
how
given.
do you respond to Sir Oliver Letwin's suggestion to PACAC last week that the organised effort across Whitehall actually requires a dedicated, what he would describe, very senior cabinet minister who commands the confidence of the Prime Minister, you, in order to make sure that the writ of these programmes really runs right through the departments? Well,
I would say that I think that it's my own view is that we have a structure already which enables us to ensure that that writ is running through departments. Obviously, it's clear to people the role that DEXU has in this, and the Secretary of State of DEXU has in setting a lot of this in train. But I think, ultimately, the important thing for departments is that this is a cross-government activity which the Cabinet discusses, the Cabinet agrees, and that is a very clear message, not just for Secretaries of State, but for their departments.
And what is the role of the First Secretary of State in this cross-departmental coordination, which would normally fall more naturally to the Cabinet Office?
Yes, and the First Secretary of State plays a role in across government issues in terms of coordinating and ensuring coordination.
Can I just ask very briefly about the result of the amendment to the EU withdrawal bill about the sifting committee? How will the government treat decisions of the sifting committee when it recommends that secondary legislation be subject to the approval of the House?
Well, obviously, the purpose of the sifting committee is to give the opportunity to the House to not just reassure itself, but actually ensure that where it thinks matters are of such significance that they should be dealt with in a particular way, i.e. affirmative procedure rather than a negative procedure, that is done. I mean, government obviously will take account of what the sifting committee has proposed. We wouldn't be putting it in place if we weren't going to do that.
Well, I'm very grateful for that assurance, because I'm afraid history is littered with recommendations from Statutory Change Committee and the European Scrutiny Committee, where recommendations for debate on the floor of the House or in committee have been very much delayed or ignored. So I think it's very important.
I was going to say, I might remind you that I once wrote a pamphlet which said that there should be more European debates on the floor of the House, and more of the decisions from the Scrutiny Committee should come to the House.
I wasn't going to be discourteous to throw that one at you, Prime Minister. But for all affirmative instruments, whether designated affirmative under the withdrawal bill or recommended affirmative by the sifting committee, how will the government schedule the business to make sure that there is reasonable opportunity for relevant committees to comment on these bills?
Well, this is not going to be an easy task, particularly if the length of time that which is available to government for dealing with these statutory instruments is limited. So it will be, I'm afraid, Parliament will be very busy.
Well, some of our honourable and right honourable friends have shown great enthusiasm for sitting up very late to scrutinise many more orders and details of legislation than we might have had to if the bill hadn't been amended. Thank you very much, Prime Minister.
Thank you, and thank you very much. We're going to move on now to a very important domestic agenda. I don't know whether you want to take a few seconds to have a glass of water or anything.
Change folders.
Change and move on. And we're going to start by talking about the NHS and social care. And just in starting that, would you recognise that there is a funding gap and that that's widening because of the scale of the increasing demand? And although the budget's increasing, that it's not keeping up with that rising demand. Would you recognise that?
Well, I recognise that there are pressures in both on the health service and also on social care. Predominantly on social care, of course, pressures from the aging population. That also has an impact on the health service, and it's precisely it's in response to the pressures that we've seen that the government has put extra money into social care. We recognise, and also did this in the autumn budget. We've put more money into the National Health Service over the next few years. I think there are also questions as to ensuring that we see health and social care operating well together where they need to operate well together. But we have put extra funding in.
Indeed, but do you accept that the concerns from NHS England that when they meet to review the mandate of the NHS, that difficult choices will have to be made because of the funding gap?
Well, as I've just said, we've recognised that extra funding is required, and we have put extra funding into the NHS and obviously into social care as well. Obviously, the discussion on the NHS mandate is taking place, but we have responded by ensuring in the autumn budget that extra funding is going into the NHS. Of course, I think what people want to see as well is to have the confidence that the money that goes into the NHS is spent as well as it can be.
Of course, and productivity in the NHS is outstripping background productivity in the wider economy. They've done extraordinarily well. But there is a concern that there remains a gap, even though extra was put in the budget. Could I just turn to the Select Committee on Long-Term Sustainability of the NHS from the House of Lords? They commented that there was a culture of short-termism across the NHS and social care. We seem to limp from one crisis, plugging a gap, to another. Would you accept that, and that we need to look to take the longer view on both NHS and social care funding?
Well, as you probably are aware, on social care, I've said that the response to the pressures that we see in the social care system should be, if you like, of three types. There's the short-term response, which is the extra money that has been put in, the 2 billion extra at the spring budget, and the social care precept that has been provided for councils to choose to apply. There's a medium-term need to respond, which I believe is about ensuring that best practice is shared, and we see best practice being adopted across the system. I think we are seeing some impact on delayed discharges in relation to that. The record is quite different, but there is indeed a need to ensure long-term sustainability of the system. That's why government is doing work on this. It's why we will be bringing forward a green paper next year, and we will have wide discussions and consultation on this. And I think what I want to see and hope we'll be able to achieve is an agreement on a sustainable system of social care into the long term, which can continue to be supported, because that's the whole point of sustainability.
Prime Minister, do you feel that you're risking missing a golden opportunity to bring both health and social care into that review?
Well, I think if as I look at it, there are certainly overlaps in relation to health and social care. I think those are already being recognised on the ground in a number of ways. The STPs, a number of the STPs, for example, are about ensuring that better integration of health and social care. If you look at some of the examples around the country, in Salford, where the Hospitals Trust is employing social workers.
Indeed, and there's yes, I accept, but we all accept there's work going on. What I'm talking about is when we're talking about how we fund the system as a whole, because, as you'll know, when the House of Lords Committee started off, their remit was to look at long-term sustainability of the NHS, but they very rapidly recognised that you couldn't see this in isolation, and so they renamed it the long-term sustainability of the NHS and adult social care. So everyone that looks at this comes eventually to the same conclusion, that we need to look at the financial sustainability of both the NHS and social care, and that's my concern.
Well, but I would say that there are of course differences between the way we approach the NHS and the way we approach social care already, in terms of the NHS being free at the point of use, for example. There already being means testing in the social care system. So there are different approaches to those two systems as we see them already. I think what is important is that we ensure that in the overlap between the NHS and social care, we are seeing good integration. And for me, that's crucially among this is actually good integration on the ground where people are working together, because this isn't about having lots of theories about this. It's actually about what people do on the ground and how they ensure that is meshing together.
In place on the ground, but when you're preparing your green paper, would you consider thinking again and bringing in health within the scope of that green paper if your advisors tell you that they think that is necessary? Would you consider it?
Well, work is already being done on the social care system, and the current expectation of that work and the current what that work is currently showing is that what we need to do in relation to that is to focus on the sustainability of the social care system, to recognise where there will be overlaps with the NHS, but to look at this, to look very much to focus specifically on the social care aspect of this, to ensure that we can get that long-term sustainability. I think that's important. I think this isn't just a sort of a large
Whenever I speak to audiences and I ask them whether or not they'd be prepared to pay more to ensure the long-term sustainability of our NHS, they agree that they would do so by a very large margin. it's more equivocal on social care. So bringing the two in together, do you feel that you might find that there's greater acceptability to increasing the funding, and how we're going to do that if you brought both health and social care within that green paper?
I think, how can I put this? I think it is right that we talk to people about the challenge that is there for social care. I think it's important that we do ensure that we have a focus on social care, and I wouldn't want to see that in some sense being subsumed in the discussion on the health service for the future and funding of the health service for the future. I think it's important that we are able to give a clear focus on the social care system.
Thank you, Prime Minister. I'll come on to Norman now.
Good afternoon, Theresa. I think the widespread concern of anyone who's looked at the long-term trends just sees the pressure growing inexorably on both the health system and the care system. And you may remember, I appreciate it's a long time ago and you've had quite a busy year, but on the 1st of February, you agreed to meet with a group of us across the political spectrum. We had a very good discussion, and you sanctioned a process of dialogue starting. And we've had something of a dialogue, which I really welcome. But I just wonder, in the run-up to the budget, we had, I think, 90 MPs signing up to a letter to you. I don't think we've had a reply yet. Again, pressing you to agree to a cross-party process to confront these long-term and growing challenges. How can we convince you that this is really necessary?
I apologise if you had... That was the letter of the 18th of November, yeah. I assume. Well, I apologise if you haven't had
not complaining.
I realise you've been busy. To that letter. And we want to continue, and we do want to continue the dialogue in relation to social care, because as I said earlier...
But just to interrupt there quickly, we're talking about health and social care because there is inevitably a connection, an interrelation, and what you do in one side of the divide always has an effect on the other.
Well, but there are... undoubtedly, as we know, aspects of the social care system and the health service that do interact, that do have an implication for each other. But also there's an awful lot that the health service does that isn't actually about the social care system or has an impact on the social care system. So I think that's why I think it's important.
But do you agree that partisan politics, the politics as we normally conduct it, just isn't going to solve these long-term pressures? You may have felt that in the general election campaign, where you tried to be quite audacious with a social care plan and got slaughtered as a result of it in terms of the political response. Doesn't that just show that we need to be prepared to work together? There's a whole group of people across Parliament who are committed to helping find a solution. That seems to me to be quite a big offer.
Well, and I would hope, and as I say, we'll be publishing a green paper, I would intend and hope that there could be very good cross-party discussions in response to that green paper, because this is not, if we're talking about the long-term sustainability of our social care system,
and the
this
health
isn't
system. And the health system.
I know you want us to be publishing a green paper. This is on both. We'll be publishing a green paper on the social care system. It's about long-term sustainability of that system, and that means not sustainability just to the end of one particular parliament or under one particular government. It actually needs to be something that's going to be genuinely sustainable into the future, something on which we can agree on.
The reason why I keep mentioning the NHS is that the pressures are intense there. Just in the NHS England's board minutes or board papers from the end of November, they pointed out that NHS constitution rights, patient rights under the Constitution, will not be met this year. We're not meeting the waiting time standards on A&E, on cancer, which are matters of life and death, and on waiting for operations, and 900 people in July were put into out-of-area beds in the mental health system. This is intolerable, isn't it? And don't we have to be prepared to work together to find solutions to this?
Well, and there have been improvements. If we look at A&E, I think it's something like 1,800 people more each day are now seen within the standard. We have the highest level of cancer survival rates. Do we want to do better and do more? Of course we do, and I accept that we do want to be able to continue to improve the service that is being provided. And yes, you know, this is a question. We're all committed to the principles that underpin our National Health Service and ensuring that that is able to provide for the future. I think we have a very... Sorry, if I may. I think one of the issues we have is there has, if I may say so, been a lot of focus on the NHS over time. There's probably been slightly less focus on the social care system. I think this is a part that we need to ensure we focus on and do provide that long-term sustainability for.
Just the final point I'd make to you is, it seems to me that in a way you have a choice in your period in government now. You can either preside over the slow and steady decline of the NHS and the care system because of the pressures we all see, or you could actually go down in history as the Prime Minister who confronts these big issues, who works with other parties and comes up with solutions that can achieve a sustainable solution. Isn't that attractive to you?
Well, I'm tempted to say I'm always suspicious about people who say if you only do this, you'll go down in history. There are various ways of going down in history, I have to say. And that is
a marvellous birthday present for the NHS on its 70th birthday, I think, though. Clive Betts, next.
New Prime Minister. I very much support efforts to get a cross-party agreement for long-term sustainable arrangements to fund social care, but there is a here and now. Any long-term changes are probably going to take several years to come in. How confident are you that every elderly person, every person with disabilities who needs social care is going to get it next year?
Well, we have made provision which we believe will ensure that councils and bodies that are responsible for this are able to provide for people. What I think is important is that as we look at this, it's not just about the funding for that care that is provided for individuals, it's also about how that care is provided at local levels and ensuring the quality of that care at local levels.
Yes, but funding is quite important, isn't it, Prime Minister? And even after the money that was put in the spring budget, which was welcomed, and it came after the CLG Select Committee report asking for extra funding, even after that money was put in, the Local Government Association, cross-party, with the Conservative majority currently, and the King's Fund independently, both said that there is a £2 billion shortfall next year in the funding for social care. Yet, no money in the budget to deal with that.
Well, we did, as you know, provide money in the budget in the spring budget.
Yeah, but even after that, £2 billion shortfall.
To provide for social care. We have given local authorities the opportunity in relation to the social care precept.
Yeah,
I think there is work that needs to be done and remains to be done in terms of ensuring best practice across all parts of the system. Because the performance across parts of the system does vary significantly in relation to certain aspects. I mean, Care Quality Commission now rates 80% of social care settings as good or outstanding, so that's good, but of course we want to ensure that people are all getting the quality of care that they need.
So the million plus people that Age UK say aren't receiving the social care they need, it's all down to councils' failures rather than lack of money, is it?
No. We have made provision in terms of extra funding that has gone into social care, but I recognise there are pressures on social care. I understand what you say about the long term, but there is a need for us to approach this. This is about putting extra money in the short term, ensuring best practice, but also that work for the long term sustainability, precisely because of those pressures that are under the
King's Fund independently are saying a £2 billion shortfall, but you seem to be saying there's enough money in there and these figures are wrong.
Well, councils have had access to £9.25 billion more dedicated funding for they will have that for adult social care over the next 3 years. That's the possibility of the social care precept together with the improved Better Care Fund, of course, including the £2 billion additional funding that was put in. So extra money is being put in to social care.
Even after that money,
and last year, just over half of councils actually increased spending in real terms on social care.
But you accept that in real terms funding is actually reduced since 2010, but demand in terms of more elderly people needing social care has actually gone up. Well, you accept that?
I recognise there are pressures in terms of the demand that is being put on the social care system. As I say, last year just over half of councils increased spending in real terms.
Do you accept in real terms it's fallen since 2010?
Well, if I say over half of councils have increased spending in real terms last year, That's a slightly different figure from the one that you're
So it's
quoting. It's a
2010,
slightly
it's
different
actually fallen
picture
in real terms.
from the one that you're quoting. But I think if you look, there are examples of councils that have shown that it is possible to expand funding and provision, and those are councils of different under different political control in various parts of the country have shown what can be done.
So you're saying there's no funding problem at all to social care?
I'm saying that we've recognised pressures that are on social care, and that's why we have put extra funding into social care.
You don't accept the King's Fund's analysis then?
I've recognised that there are pressures on social care, and we have put extra funding into social care.
Thank you. We're going to come on to education and Robert Halford.
Prime Minister, thank you. With the resignation of the Social Mobility Commissioners, would it not be a good idea to reboot the Commission, put a Social Justice Commission at the heart of Downing Street with the best experts in the land, and use that Commission to make sure it had teeth by making sure it looked at every domestic policy for the impact on social justice?
Well, I think we have an opportunity to refresh the Social Mobility Commission. I think what you're asking me is, will I turn it into something slightly different and make it more wide-ranging?
Because at the moment it's just a state think tank, which is very good and publishes worthy reports, but it has no teeth. Why not give it teeth and use it to really reboot social justice, and why not put it at the heart of Downing Street? And use it to stress test every domestic policy in terms of social justice?
Well, I mean, looking at issues around social justice is one of the things that we do already, and we do. Obviously, I was clear about the importance that I attached to this when I became Prime Minister, and we continue to address this in a number of different ways. One can look at different governance structures, one can look at different ways to approach this. Ultimately, how we deal with these social justice issues will be down for how the decisions that government takes, the policies we introduce, the legislation we introduce where it's appropriate for legislation. Obviously, a lot of this won't be about legislation. If you're saying, should we take the opportunity to, as I say, refresh the Social Mobility Commission, I think that this does give us an opportunity to do that. But the remit that we have in government, the purpose that we have in government does go across all of the whole range of social justice issues. Just one example of what we've done in that is the racial disparity audit, for example. Pretty uncomfortable reading, but for the first time a government actually said, let's look at what's actually happening out there. So I would hope we've shown our commitment to this.
Well, you said when you took office, we will do everything we can to help anybody, whatever your background, to go as far as your talents will take you. And if I can just bring you on to the subject of exclusions and alternative provision, you will know that just 1.1% of pupils in alternative provision get 5 good GCSEs. 63% of prisoners have been excluded. Now, it's suggested that some schools are gaming the system to offload challenging students. And do you not agree that urgent action, one, is needed on alternative provision and exclusions, but also to make schools more accountable for the educational outcomes of the children that they exclude?
Well, I think the Education Department has been looking at this whole question of exclusions, because you're absolutely right that there are some aspects of this that we should be concerned about, and as you cited yourself, the percentage of the prison population who have at some stage been excluded, and these are exactly the sort of issues we need to be looking at. But the Department of Education has been looking at the exclusion process and at how that can be improved so that we make sure that those pupils who are excluded are given appropriate education. But I'm sure the ideas that you've suggested will be looked at by the DFE.
Thousands of children are being educated in alternative settings that are unregistered and don't even fall within Ofsted's remits. And would you not say it's time to change this so that every educational establishment is properly scrutinised?
Well, I'm because I don't have the figures in front of me, I'm not sure what you're encompassing, what you're covering when you talk about the alternative provision for education. Of course, there are some children who are not in an educational establishment as such who will be homeschool tutored, which is a different environment.
Oh, I'm including that.
You're including that in that. Well, I think what I would say is what we want to do is to ensure that children get the appropriate education and get a good quality of education. And I think it is important that we see that, because I think like you, would say that actually getting a good quality of education is absolutely a fundamental in terms of improving social mobility and ensuring people are able to get the best opportunities in life.
And very finally, Prime Minister, the manifesto said we will make the system easier for young people taking technical and vocational routes. We will introduce a UCAS-style portal for technical education. And nothing appears to have been said or done on this since the election. Is this still the government's commitment to deliver this important change?
Yes, indeed, in the T levels that we're introducing. There's various aspects.
About the UCAS, specifically the UCAS for FE.
Oh, sorry, the UCAS form for FE.
In the manifesto, yeah.
Yes, I'm afraid I will have to take that away and look at it specifically what we've done on the UCAS form. But it's our intention to make the ability for young people to move into different types of education provision and to ensure that nobody is cut off from getting the opportunities and making the most of their talents and their skills. But if I may, I will look at the specific point that you've raised on the UCAS. Sorry, I misheard your question.
Thank you. We come now to Frankfield.
Prime Minister, for a long period of time now, governments have increased in real terms the benefits of pensioners and have cut the benefits of people of working age. There's been a policy of quite massive application of standards, and there's now reports of hardship in our constituencies turning into destitution. Might you consider an overall impact study of what the welfare reforms, as they're called, a sanctions policy has been, to see where, in fact, there might be need now to raise relatively the benefit of families to those who are pensioners?
Well, we do assess the cumulative impact of welfare reforms, tax and public spending changes on household incomes, and the latest analysis of that was given in the autumn budget. It accompanied the autumn budget in November. Obviously, we want our welfare system to provide a safety net for those who need it. We're spending over £90 billion a year on working age benefits. I think in terms of the how we best provide for people, I mean, of course, I continue to believe that the best route out of poverty is through work, and actually helping to get people into the workplace is an absolutely crucial part of this. But as I say, the overall impact of the welfare reform, tax and public spending plans on household incomes is assessed and was published in accompaniment to the budget in November.
As you've been mired in having to give most detailed replies, can I actually follow this up in correspondence with you? Whether in fact, for the vulnerable tail end, our official data don't as effectively capture what's happening to them as maybe. But as you say, the best route out of poverty is work. You initiated the Taylor Review to look at what was happening in the labour market. And you've had a joint report from the committee that Rachel chairs and that I have chaired. Given the importance the government has attached to, in one respect, giving us a national living wage below which no one should fall, the evidence by which employers are getting round this, and the other areas where the committees made suggestions to you about where we need legislative change, without trying to entice you, you'll be the most famous Prime Minister in the world.
This wouldn't be going down in history again, would it, Frank?
By following this recommendation, given that it is you that initiated this review, how serious and over what timescale are you going to seize the initiative back on this? Or might, as we suggested, Rachel and I, it's something that we might, with civil servants' guidance, do the bill for you?
Well, certainly, and I appreciate the work that both your committees have put into this particular issue. Of course, I'm serious about the Taylor Review. I wouldn't have commissioned it if I didn't think there was an issue there that we needed to address as government, and we'll respond to the Taylor Review shortly. We did say in the budget that we will be consulting on employment status and looking at the case and the various options for longer-term reform to make the employment status test for employment rights and tax clearer. Obviously, you'll appreciate this is that particular aspect is a complex issue, and I think it's right that we look at it in the round. But the point of commissioning Taylor was to say we have a changing employment market. We need to ensure that the structures that we've got, that the rights that we have, and every aspect actually reflects that changing market. And so we're looking very seriously at the report that Matthew Taylor produced, and obviously we'll look at the work that both of your committees did as well. I note your offer to take the work away from the civil service, or perhaps with the support of the civil service, do it yourselves. But we will obviously want to respond to
it. It is clear from this broadcast, Prime Minister, how the huge amount of energy that you have to put into the Brexit negotiation. And I welcome the creation of this Brexit cabinet, and that you, in a sense, changing the whole tempo. There is a danger of you trying to do too much when other people want to help you. And Rachel and I want to help you on this, obviously along lines that you accept, but you don't have to do everything, Prime Minister.
As I say, we'll respond to the Taylor review. I have to say, I think, and I hope the female members of the committee will agree, that women are pretty good at multitasking.
Yeah. There are limits even to good multitaskers.
I think that Frank raises an important point, and that all the energy of government is going into Brexit. And I think you have huge goodwill around this table for joint working. We've heard from both CLG, Committee Science and Technologies and Health, from BASE and from Work and Pensions. Can I urge you again, Prime Minister, to really see the Liaison Committee and select committees as something that can really help you to get important domestic policy agendas across the line, particularly challenging when we have a hung parliament and Brexit. So I really hope that you'll take that opportunity.
Well, I recognise the work that the select committees do, and obviously this committee bringing as it does the chair of the select committees together. I would say that it is not the case that the whole of the energy of government is being put into Brexit. Obviously, this is a very big task that the government is undertaking, and we are putting the right level of expertise, the right level of resource into doing it. But we are also doing the various other things as well, alongside, the changes we're making on technical education that have been referred to, the issues on social justice like the racial disparity audit, a whole variety of issues that are being addressed, the social mobility action plan, a whole variety of issues being addressed in other areas too. So it's not the case that the government is putting all its energy into Brexit.
Nobody doubts your skills with multitasking, but
The challenge we've got is equivalent to the last war. Churchill didn't concern himself with the subjects we've now got at the end of our session with you, but he did make sure that they were catered for in different ways. And just for your health's sake, I think it's just, as Sarah said, there's a real opportunity of governing differently while you get on with the main issue, which the country wants you to get on with, and which the polls show, despite all the statements to the contrary in the Commons and so on, that they wish you to complete.
Well, and I want to ensure that we complete the other aspects as well as Brexit. Although I'm tempted to say I have been tempted by not just yourself but also another member of the committee to go down in history on domestic policy issues, which is rather than the Brexit issue.
I was joking about that analogy.
Right, now we come now to Maria Miller.
Prime Minister, the issue of sexual harassment in Hollywood and Westminster has been making the headlines, but the truth is that more than half of women in this country suffer sexual harassment, often in silence. What's your government doing to tackle that problem?
Well, I think there's a number of things that government can do, but it's not just obviously about government. It's about attitudes and the approach that people take in different environments to this particular issue. Government, I think, can help through the making clear through actions such as, if you like, one end of the issue of sexual abuse on violence against women and girls, where we act, what we do, and setting a very clear message in relation to that. I would hope that the work that is being done that I initiated in bringing party leaders together, and that the leader of the House of Commons has now taken up with the working group on looking at the issues of harassment and indeed other aspects, which are not just about sexual harassment but bullying here in the workplace of Parliament, also sends a signal to people. But this isn't going to be something that is changed simply by government taking one action or another, because it is about the attitudes that people have within workplaces, within other environments.
But do you think the government's violence against women strategy should actually directly address this? Because it's the most common form of abuse that women face, but it's not tackled within that strategy.
Well, I think what I would say is that the violence against women strategy, I think first of all it was important that we focus on that aspect as and committed to that strategy and continue to put policies in place that deliver on that. I think in terms of the wider issue of sexual harassment, this is something which we can talk about, but if what we're able to do on the ending violence against women and girls is we're putting specific pieces of legislation in place, like the new domestic violence legislation. There have been issues around ring-fence funding which we provided to deal with this. This question of sexual harassment, I think, is taking place in a variety of settings. Is a slightly, as I say, it's a wider issue, and I'm not sure that there is a single, if you like, silver bullet answer for the government to introduce that, in a strategy or otherwise, that is going to deal with this, precisely because it is one of the hardest things to deal with, which is about culture and attitudes.
But there are some specifics, aren't there? And I'm thinking now about the case of Zelda Perkins, who worked for Harvey Weinstein, but also the case of non-disclosure agreements more widely. You know, should it be a crime to offer money to employees to silence them in relation to a wrongdoing? I think people are pretty astonished at the way non-disclosure agreements are being used in this sort of case.
Well, of course, if you look at this issue, if I can, in various layers of this, in relation to gagging clauses that try to prevent workers from whistleblowing, i.e. disclosing wrongdoing in a workplace to the relevant authority, potentially the police, but also, for example, MPs in the public interest, those are not legally valid or enforceable. Now, there are occasions where somebody parts company from an employer where there will be a settlement agreement which can contain a confidentiality agreement, and that can be to provide a way of resolving a workplace dispute or ending a relationship without going through the stress and cost of an employment tribunal. But those confidentiality clauses should go no further than is necessary to protect matters such as client confidentiality and commercial interest. And there are various protections on that. The Employment Rights Act 1996 makes settlement agreements unenforceable unless the employee has had independent advice in both public and private sectors. ACAS has a statutory code and practical guidance on settlement agreements that make clear that gagging clauses which attempt to prevent or restrict an individual from making a protected disclosure in settlement agreements are not permissible. And we've also produced guidance on settlement agreements and whistleblowing. So I think there are various ways in which we're trying to ensure that these are used in those cases where it is appropriate to use them, and where they are used, that they're used properly and not inappropriately.
The evidence would be emerging that sometimes they're not used appropriately, and often those that are being forced into taking NDAs or agreeing to NDAs would not be aware that they are, as you have rightly said, unenforceable. Will you review the way NDAs are regulated to try and stop that happening? After all, we are dealing with the legal profession here, which is a highly regulated profession, possibly misusing NDAs.
Well, I'm certainly happy to go away and look at the structures that we've got around non-disclosure agreements and the evidence that is coming forward about how they're being used.
Thank you, Prime Minister.
Thank you. And I know you have another engagement to go to, Prime Minister, but could I just follow up on a letter that I sent you last week? And it was following a request from the Chair of the Defence Committee to hear from the National Security Advisor, who is currently declining to attend the committee. And it was just to reiterate that it's the unanimous view of this committee that we feel it's an obstruction to the work of the Defence Committee for him not to appear. And can I ask whether you do have a response to that now, whether you will allow him to attend the Defence Committee?
I will obviously respond formally to the letter that you sent me,
Yes.
and I recognise the role that the Select Committees take. But I think it's important to recognise that the National Security Advisor is an advisor to the National Security Council and to me. He has already provided evidence to Dr. Lewis in the Joint Committee on the National Security Strategy. He's coordinating work on the National Security Capability Review. That's what I have asked him and the National Security Council has asked him to do. But his advice will be to me and for the National Security Council to take and be accountable for decisions. Now, when we look at appearances by civil servants in front of select committees, of course, it's ministers who are accountable to Parliament, and civil servants give evidence on the basis that they do so on behalf of their minister and under their directions, because it's the minister and not the civil servant who is accountable to Parliament for the evidence that's given to the committee. So, as I see it, Mark is giving evidence to the Joint Committee on the National Security Strategy. I think that's where it's appropriate for him to give evidence. He's already done that.
If I may, though, Prime Minister, Julian Lewis only had a few minutes at the Joint Committee, and the Defence Committee are specifically undertaking a review of the National Security Capability Review. So they feel that it's very difficult for them to carry out their work without his appearance before them, and there is precedent for this happening, clear precedent for the Security Advisor to appear at defence committees in the past. So we feel very strongly that he should appear. So that's what I would like to ask you to consider.
Well, I assume that if the Defence Committee is looking at the National Security Capability Review, it is looking at it in relation to its aspects of defence. And the Defence Secretary and his permanent secretary regularly give evidence to that committee and are happy to do so in relation to that particular issue.
That's good.
Yeah, but I will write to you, Chairman, and put my view in.
Yes,
in writing.
I have to say that we're unhappy about that as chairs, because we don't see that there would be any harm, but there would certainly be great benefit, and it would really assist the Defence Committee in their work to have Mr. Sedwell appear in front of them. And I think we need to establish very clearly what would be the harm in him appearing.
Well, it is, as I say, ministers are accountable to Parliament. It is ministers are able to agree that civil servants who are responsible to them for their areas of activity appear in front of select committees, and those civil servants appear in front of the relevant select committee. Mark, I believe that the relevant select committee for the National Security Advisor is the Joint Committee on the National Security Strategy. As I say, aspects of defence can be covered by the Defence Secretary and his permanent secretary in response to the Defence Committee, as indeed any other departmental Secretary of State and their permanent secretary would give evidence to their departmental committee.
I know Bernard has a follow-up point.
Forgive me for intervening on this matter, but I think it's a matter of precedent. The National Security Advisor has appeared in front of other committees and been very helpful. He's appeared in front of my predecessor committee, previous National Security Advisor. So that's a matter of precedent. And as a matter of principle, it is for select committees to choose who their witnesses should be, and the government should surely assist select committees in that. It is not for the government to decide which witnesses appear before select committees. And that
so, the Prime Minister speaking to the Select Committee. She's been grilled for about the last hour and a half or thereabouts. What did they glean from her? What might happen next? We'll be talking about that in more detail in just a few moments here on Sky News. Very good afternoon. This is Sky News at 5 o'clock. We may be just 5 days away from Christmas, but there's been no winding down for Theresa May quite yet. At lunchtime, she faced the final PMQs of 2017, and she's now spent nearly 2 hours giving evidence before the Commons Liaison Committee, which is made up of the chairs of all the various select committees. Much of it, predictably, has focused on Brexit, with the Prime Minister denying that she begged for a full 2-year transition period after the UK leaves the EU. In any event, it seems she won't be getting it. This morning, the EU's chief negotiator said it should be over by the end of 2020, and that means it will last a maximum of 21 months.
I haven't begged the European Union for 2 more years. If you look at what I said in the Lancaster House speech, you will see that we were already talking about the concept of a smooth and orderly process of withdrawing from the European Union. That is what the implementation period is about. This is not 2 more years to negotiate with the European Union. This is about 2 years when practically both businesses and governments will be able to put in place the changes necessary to move from the current relationship to the future partnership that we will have.
It should be of a short and specific duration. At Florence, Theresa May in her speech referred to a maximum of 2 years. Our position, the European Commission's position, is that this would run logically to the 31st of December 2020, because that's also the end of, that was the duration of the current multi-annual financial framework.
Our chief political correspondent John Craig standing by in Westminster for us this afternoon. She got a proper grilling, didn't she? She's more of a sort of cricket night watchman, though, batting it back towards them. All this with 5 days away from Christmas. She's still putting the hours in.
Well, I was going to say, actually, Kay, that last week Nick Bowles, the Tory MP, said she put in a performance worthy of Geoffrey Boycott. She said she took that as a compliment. It was another boycott-like performance, really. As you were saying, the Brexit dominated the hearing. It was 1 hour and 45 minutes in total, of which 1 hour and 10 minutes was taken up by 9 senior MPs asking about Brexit. Questions about the Irish border, the £39 billion divorce bill, which agencies were staying in. Even one from Angus MacNeil of the SNP about Spanish political prisoners. More on Northern Ireland. And then this very tetchy exchange between the Prime Minister and her old foe, the former Shadow Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper. This is when it started to get heated.
The principle of what we want to do is to ensure that Parliament is able to have what we have always said would be a meaningful vote before, as I say, before the European Parliament has its vote, and before we then bring that agreement into the legislation here in the United Kingdom. But the bit that ensures that that withdrawal agreement is in UK law will be the EU withdrawal agreement and implementation bill.
And will that happen before the treaty is ratified? Yes or no?
Well, it depends what you're talking about by formal ratification of the treaty, because there were various processes in this. Before we can't bring a withdrawal agreement bill before the House unless we've got an agreement, a withdrawal agreement.
So that,
I mean, that's just, you know,
so the answer is no. There will be no vote on statute.
But Parliament will have voted on that withdrawal agreement. Parliament will have had its say.
You didn't frankly have the balls to put country before party.